proving misinformation. What's your message to platforms like Facebook?
They're killing people. I mean, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. And they're killing people.
Powerful words from the president. That was President Biden just this afternoon, responding to a question there from our colleague, Peter Alexander, on the dangers of COVID misinformation spreading, in that instance, on Facebook. His grave warning comes after the U.S. Surgeon General yesterday issued his first formal advisory to declare this, that the lies are an urgent threat to public health, criticizing tech and social media companies for not doing enough to fight it on their platforms. COVID cases have doubled in the last 3 weeks. A pandemic of the unvaccinated is what the CDC director also called it today. The White House says the facts are now, quote, a matter of life and death. Joining our conversation, Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press and an MSNBC political analyst. Clint Watts is back. You know, Jonathan Lemire, we all watched this in slow motion, right? The ex-president lying about COVID the whole time, lying about how damaging it is, even after the fact. This president has done an extraordinary sort of human logistical thing, getting needles and vaccines into everyone who's able and willing. But what he's up against now really is the damage left behind by his predecessor.
Yeah, and it's a deeply frustrated President Joe Biden and his staff about the pockets of this country that refuse to get vaccinated. At this point, anyone who wants a vaccine has access to one. That's no longer an issue. That was early in the pandemic, no longer. And now, certainly, there are some people who are hesitant, who public health officials can still believe, that can be convinced, can be told, like, look, we know this vaccine was developed quickly, but it's safe. We'll show you why you can. We'll make it very easy for you to get. And so there's still some hope there. And, of course, children. People are still waiting for a vaccine to be approved for those under 12. But setting all those aside, there is still a pocket of people, and polling shows they are largely Republicans, who are refusing to take this vaccine. Some young adults as well. Those young adults might feel like they don't need it because they're invincible. But for those Republicans, it's because it's become a political statement. And certainly there's been an anti-science strain sort of undergirding the parts of the Republican Party for quite some time now that even predates Donald Trump. But he's certainly accelerated it. And we heard from him just undermining trust in all sorts of government institutions throughout his time in office, even before the pandemic. That adds up. His lies parroted by the conservative media, his followers willing to believe anything he says and distrust anything the mainstream media or public health officials or Democrats say. And then, of course, when the virus does arrive and the president downplayed it day after day after day, that adds up too. And he's never, even though he has now started saying to his followers, hey, take the vaccine, he's never given it a full-throated endorsement. And frankly, it may be too late. At this point, it's part of people's political identity to say they won't take this vaccine. It's amplified on social media, and it is holding back vaccination rates across the country as this very contagious variant spreads.
And that is where we are. I want to spend one more minute on where we are. And this was so interesting, Clint Watts. This is Jen Psaki. I'm sure this wasn't news to you, but explaining where the vast majority of disinformation comes from. Let's watch her. We'll talk on the other side.
There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media platforms. All of them remain active on Facebook, despite some even being banned on other platforms, including Facebook, ones that Facebook owns.
So, Clint, Facebook can't take down 12 people who are spreading 65% of the lies about COVID?
Yeah, Nicole, part of the challenge is they're policing content. You know, they don't necessarily police people. And that's where the breakdown in all this comes, whether it's the election last year or COVID-19 last year or vaccines this year. There's way too much focus on trying to police bad content. Look, people can make disinformation, misinformation faster than it can be policed. And that's why they're always beating these social media companies across the board. Separately, though, a lot of these groups have moved into a private fashion. So it's much more difficult to detect who they are. They also know how to skirt around it. While I thought the Surgeon General's report yesterday was the best government document I've seen on misinformation and disinformation ever put out by the U.S. government. It was really excellent. Lots of great recommendations. However, from a research perspective, what the press secretary said is absolutely correct. Usually about 1% of the manipulators make about 90% of the nonsense. That's across almost anything. You really got to focus at the top of the cone, the top of the pyramid. If you can really focus on those individuals that are creating outright lies that are dangers to public safety, that's critical. There are two things I'd like to add, Nicole. One,
Please.
From the social media companies across the board, they don't know what to police because the regulations just aren't there. And they're either getting beat up by Section 230 and free speech on the political right or about misinformation, disinformation on the political left. So that they're in this constant twist about what to do.
I want to read from this excellent government report. We don't hear that very often, but it was pretty riveting. This is sort of
I know, it was really good. I'm a nerd.
You threw me for a minute, but I've got it. So I'm going to read this to you, Jonathan Lemire, because more than any other area, this is a White House that has a plan. And this is a White House that seems to always have a plan B and a plan C. And it appears this is their, break glass when you come up against the COVID disinformation on the vaccination pace. So this is what it says. Teachers, Murthy said, should explain lessons on media literacy and critical thinking. Journalists, he suggested, should work to responsibly debunk health misinformation without inadvertently spreading it further. Public health professionals should do a better job answering questions and explaining why public health guidelines sometimes change based on new information. As for everyday Americans, they should verify questionable health information with trusted sources. It sounds like the mass communications part of this may be over. And what the government is doing is directing, again, this is targeted around the hesitant, the scared, the maybe sort of straddling the middle of the information streams, back to their pediatricians, back to their sort of own personal spheres of influence. Is that the White House strategy, Jonathan?
Yeah, it is. And certainly media literacy is a major problem in this country and has been for a long time. And it's only gotten worse here as people don't understand who they can believe and who they can trust. But in terms of a strategy, that's right. White House is trying to do this on two tracks. Look, they're not eliminating the idea of the big gesture, right? President Biden is still going to say, hey, you should get the vaccine. We saw, I was there at the White House this week when pop star Olivia Rodrigo came in and she spoke to the reporters in the briefing room and she's cut a bunch of videos. They're going to be on TikTok. Those are for young Americans, perhaps, who don't think they need the vaccine. And she's trying to convince them, yes, you do, to preserve yourself, but also your loved ones who you might spread the virus to. But they're also doing that. They're trying to do the really granular at the community level, trying to empower, whether it's pediatricians or community leaders, civic groups, pastors, whoever it might be, a person of some authority and trust in a community to say to people like, look, I understand you're confused, you're scared. Maybe you don't always trust or believe what you hear from Washington, but I'm trying to tell you this is good. You can do this. I've done it myself. You should take the vaccine. They are hopeful. Look, they're not giving away the stunts, right? There's going to be things at ballparks and NASCAR races and at grocery stores, but they're also going to try to do small things too, basically trying to flood the zone, because what is the backdrop of all of this is a real worry. We are seeing mask recommendations go back in place in major cities like Los Angeles and Las Vegas. We're seeing the spread of this virus right now, mostly in those red states, but they fear it could be elsewhere. They realize that right now is a moment to try to get ahead of this before weather starts getting colder and viruses start spread even more easily.
Yeah, and I mean, Clinton, this brings me back to where we connected in the last block. I mean, with the virus levels, I don't know that we call them surging yet, but I think they're doubled since last week. They're largely in red states where the percentage of the vaccinated is at the lowest end for our country. But again, mask mandates are now part of the political hot war, if you will. I mean, COVID restrictions were also named, along with lies about the election result, as being an animating ideology for the current domestic violent extremism threat in this country. And I wonder what concerns you have from a security standpoint if public health experts want us to go back to indoor mask mandates or other public health measures.
Nicole, I think it will tip off a whole series of protests, mobilizations, and violence if we have to go back to that fall. I mean, my home state of Missouri is ravaged with it right now. They have their surge, which is essentially what happened in New York for us last year. There it's just out of control. And I don't know how they would be able to actually institute those controls again. I really don't. And even in the Northeast and on the West Coast, as they start to push these controls, you will immediately see a reaction. There's another horizon coming, Nicole, which is the vaccination of small children. When that issue comes to fold, that will bring together lots of anti-vax audience. These are anti-vax audiences over the last decade that are predominantly political left. You'll have the GOP supporters who just refuse to move in that direction, that will become a really hot flashpoint. And this will all converge really as we head into the fall when the country has to get back on its feet. If I could, mention anything from that report that I would emphasize more than things like literacy is great. It's going to have a marginal return at best. You have to scale truth. We have to take messages of truth on the offensive. I think that's the first part, and they did address that in the report. I think the second part is we are moving from the tactical, information or strategic information campaigns to the very tactical ones. We need to be doing messenger judo, as I would say, which is you've got to go into social media and on the ground and have messengers that look like and talk like these targeted audiences that are just refusing the vaccine. That's physicians. That's ideological leaders, thought leaders. This is people that are trusted in communities. We got to get their message out. They're the social media influencers we need to help on a national level. We got to bring them together in a network to really get this going. And I think the last thing is fear travels faster than calm. And we need to be, not trying to coax people nicely. We need to be telling them this should be a real fear for you. If you're unvaccinated, your chance of dying is astronomically higher than any complication of the vaccine. You are literally, at this point, if you're dying of COVID-19 and you're unvaccinated, that is a choice. It really doesn't make sense at this point that you can't take these basic mitigation methods. And it's not just about you. It's about our whole country. If you want our country back on our feet, you don't want to wear a mask come fall, you want kids in school, all you got to do is get a vaccine. You can get it very quickly.